The night before my medical school interview, my sister poured bleach on my only blazer. My parents told me to stop making a scene. I wore it anyway. The dean looked at my bleached jacket, then at my last name. His expression changed. Wait, you are her. My name is Monica, and I am 33 years old. 10 years ago, I stood in the kitchen of my childhood home in a wealthy suburb of Boston and realized my own family was actively trying to destroy my future. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own success while your family tried to tear you down. The morning of the most important day of my life began with the sharp, toxic smell of chlorine. I was 23 years old, and I had spent the last 4 years working overnight shifts at a local diner just to pay for my undergraduate classes. My parents had refused to contribute a single cent to my education. I walked into the kitchen at 6 in the morning, my stomach tied in nervous knots about my medical school interview at the state's most prestigious hospital. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. I had saved my tip money for 2 months to buy a simple black professional blazer from a second-hand store. I had carefully tailored the seams myself by hand in my bedroom late at night because I could not afford a professional seamstress. I had hung it on the back of the dining room chair the night before after carefully ironing every inch of the fabric. But when I walked into the kitchen, the chair was empty. I followed the overwhelming chemical odor to the stainless steel sink. My heart completely stopped in my chest. My only professional blazer was crumpled at the bottom of the basin, soaking wet and dripping with a thick, pungent puddle of concentrated bleach. The dark black fabric was already rapidly turning a sickly shade of mottled orange and rust. The harsh chemicals stung my eyes and burned the back of my throat. I heard a casual thud behind me. I turned slowly and watched my older sister Ashley toss an empty bleach bottle into the kitchen trash can. She did not look guilty or surprised. She simply leaned against the marble counter and crossed her arms over her expensive designer sweater. Ashley was the undeniable golden child of our family. She had never worked a single day in her life. Our parents had paid her full tuition at an elite private university. They bought her a brand new car for her high school graduation and funded her luxury apartment downtown. She was currently preparing for her own medical residency placement exams, a path our parents had practically paved with gold for her. Oops. Ashley smiled a thin, malicious smile that reached nowhere near her eyes. I thought it was the fabric softener. I was just trying to do a load of laundry early this morning. Guess you will have to skip that medical school interview, right? The lie was so blatant and ridiculous that it took my breath away. Fabric softener does not smell like toxic chemicals. You do not accidentally soak a tailored suit jacket in pure bleach. This was a calculated, deliberate act of sabotage designed to keep me in my place. Ashley could not stand the idea of me stepping into the medical field. The medical field was supposed to be her exclusive domain. She was supposed to be the brilliant, successful doctor of the family, while I was supposed to remain the quiet, struggling failure who made them look better by comparison. Before I could even formulate a response, my mother Barbara walked into the kitchen. She was wearing her pristine silk morning robe and carrying a steaming mug of imported coffee. She took one look at me standing paralyzed over the sink and then looked at the ruined blazer. She did not ask what happened. She did not scold Ashley for destroying my property. She simply took a sip of her coffee and sighed in profound annoyance, as if my pain was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to her morning routine. "Stop making a scene, Monica," my mother said, her tone completely devoid of any maternal warmth or empathy. "You know Ashley has her own residency placement exams today, and she needs a calm environment to focus. Do not ruin her morning with your drama." I stared at my mother in absolute disbelief. My drama? My sister had just intentionally destroyed my only interview outfit hours before my scheduled appointment, and I was the one being told to quiet down. My hands gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger and desperation. "That was my only blazer. My interview is in 2 hours. I cannot go to the admissions board looking like this." My mother rolled her eyes and waved her manicured hand dismissively. "Then just wear it as is or stay home," she said coldly. You are not cut out for medicine anyway. You do not have your sister's pedigree. Why you keep insisting on chasing this foolish pipe dream is beyond me. You should just accept that you belong in a low-level laboratory assisting people like your sister, who actually have the talent for this profession. Her words hit me harder than any physical blow could have. Pedigree. She was talking about money. She was talking about the fact that they had groomed Ashley for success while leaving me to fend for myself. They had actively hidden my high school achievement awards. They had refused to co-sign my student loans. They wanted me to fail, so their narrative about the perfect older daughter and the disappointing younger daughter would remain intact. Ashley smirked, picking up an apple from the fruit bowl and taking a loud, crunching bite. Listen to Mom Monica. She knows what she is talking about. You walking into that boardroom today would just embarrass the family name. Do us all a favor and stay home where you belong. For 23 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had lowered my head and accepted their emotional abuse because I wanted so desperately to be loved by them. I wanted to prove that I was worthy of their affection. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just achieved enough, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Ashley. But standing in that kitchen, inhaling the toxic fumes of my ruined blazer, I realized a fundamental truth. They would never love me. They would never support me. They would only ever see me as a threat to Ashley's fragile, manufactured superiority. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I reached into the sink and pulled the dripping heavy fabric out of the basin. The bleach had eaten away the cheap lining, and the exterior was a chaotic mess of rust-colored stains and stark white chemical burns. The material felt slimy and corrosive against my bare hands, but I did not let go. I turned my back on my mother and sister. I walked silently to the hallway bathroom and grabbed a handful of paper towels. I pressed the fabric as dry as I possibly could. My fingers burned from the concentrated chemicals, but I ignored the pain. I walked back out to the hallway where my simple white button-down blouse and black slacks were waiting on a hanger. I put on my clothes. Then, without a single word to the two women watching me from the kitchen, I slid my arms into the ruined, chemical-stained blazer. The damp fabric clung to my shoulders. The bleach immediately began seeping through my thin cotton blouse, burning the sensitive skin on my back and arms. The smell was overpowering, making my eyes water and my throat constrict. It was humiliating. It was agonizing. But it was also my armor. I grabbed my worn briefcase, walked out the front door, and let it shut heavily behind me. I did not look back. The bus ride into the city was an exercise in pure endurance. Passengers moved away from me, coughing and covering their noses, because the smell of chlorine radiating from my clothes was so intense. Every jolt of the bus caused the wet fabric to rub against my skin, deepening the chemical burn on my shoulders. I stared straight ahead, focusing entirely on my breathing. I refused to let the tears fall. I refused to let my family win. They wanted me to hide in shame. They wanted me to surrender my future just because they had ruined a piece of clothing. They severely underestimated my resilience. When I finally walked through the towering glass doors of the prestigious hospital, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. The lobby was a massive expanse of polished marble, gleaming chrome, and hushed professional conversations. Doctors in pristine white coats walked purposefully past me. I approached the directory and found the location for the medical school admissions boardroom on the 14th floor. I rode the elevator up, standing rigid in the corner. When the doors opened, I stepped into a waiting area that looked more like a luxury hotel lounge than a hospital floor. There were plush leather chairs, expensive artwork on the walls, and a large mahogany reception desk. Seated in the waiting area were 6 other applicants. They were the epitome of privilege. They wore perfectly tailored designer suits, expensive watches, and confident smiles. They chatted easily with each other, projecting an air of absolute belonging. When I walked into the room, the conversation immediately died. 6 pairs of eyes locked onto me. I saw their expressions shift from casual interest to profound shock and then to undisguised disgust. They looked at my damp, rust-stained blazer. They wrinkled their noses as the overwhelming smell of bleach permeated the quiet waiting room. One of the male applicants actually laughed under his breath and turned away, covering his mouth. A female applicant leaned over and whispered something to her neighbor, pointing discreetly at the chemical burns on my sleeves. I walked directly to the reception desk. The administrative assistant looked up from her computer, and her professional smile faltered. She leaned back in her chair, clearly repulsed by the fumes radiating from my jacket. She looked me up and down, taking in my ruined clothes and my pale, determined face. "Excuse me, miss," the receptionist said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This area is reserved for medical school applicants awaiting their board interviews. The public restrooms are on the first floor." I stood tall, ignoring the searing pain in my shoulders and the judgmental stares of the wealthy students behind me. I placed my identification on the mahogany desk. "I am not looking for the restroom," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "My name is Monica. I am here for my 9 o'clock interview with the admissions board." The receptionist looked at my identification and then back at my bleached, ruined blazer. The disgusted whispers in the waiting room grew louder. I stood my ground, the toxic chemicals burning my skin, knowing that I was about to walk into the lion's den. I had absolutely nothing left to lose and an entire empire to build. I stood in the center of the massive mahogany boardroom. 5 distinguished doctors sat across a vast, polished table, staring at me as if I were a biological hazard. The pungent, blinding smell of chlorine bleach radiated from my ruined jacket, filling the enclosed, air-conditioned space. A female doctor on the far left pinched the bridge of her nose and leaned away. Another senior board member checked his heavy gold watch and loudly sighed. They were already dismissing me before I even opened my mouth. I could see the rejection forming in their tight lips, their crossed arms, and their judgmental eyes. Then Dr. Gregory Thorne, the Dean of Medicine, picked up my application file. He did not look repulsed by my appearance. He looked deeply confused. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and read the top page intensely. Then he flipped to the second page. He looked up at me, then back down at the crisp white paper in his hands. "Wait a minute," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tense, oppressive silence of the room. "Your legal first name is listed here on your official background check as Eleanor, but your application materials all say you go by Monica." My parents hated the name Eleanor. It was my paternal grandmother's name, and my mother despised that side of the family. They forced me to use my middle name, Monica, since I was a young child trying to erase any connection to a woman they considered beneath them. "Yes, Dr. Thorne," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight despite the searing chemical burn developing on my shoulders. "Eleanor is my legal birth name." Dr. Thorne stood up abruptly. His heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The other board members stared at him in utter shock. He walked around the massive table and stopped right in front of me, completely ignoring the toxic fumes radiating from my damp clothes. "Are you telling me you are Eleanor M. Wilson?" he asked, his voice suddenly intense and remarkably urgent. "Yes, sir, I am, the author of the preliminary cardiac tissue regeneration paper, the exact same paper submitted to the Independent International Research Portal last October," he demanded, stepping even closer. The room went completely silent. The other doctors leaned forward, suddenly hanging on my every word. The disdain in their eyes vanished, replaced by intense, desperate curiosity. "Yes," I said. "That is my research. I developed the algorithms during my overnight shifts working at a local diner using a borrowed laptop." Dr. Thorne took a deep, ragged breath and rubbed his temples. "This is incredible," he muttered almost to himself. "We have been trying to license the algorithms from that paper for our new surgical robotics division for 3 solid months. The research portal only provided an anonymous contact email for an Eleanor M. Wilson. We sent dozens of lucrative offers, but we never received a single reply. We thought the author had abandoned the project. I never checked that specific email account after November." I admitted, keeping my tone strictly professional. "I created that encrypted email address solely to register my copyright with the Federal Patent Office. I did not know anyone was looking for me." One of the other board members, a sharp-looking woman in an immaculate gray suit, spoke up. "Dr. Thorne, What exactly is going on here? We just admitted a candidate into the luxury surgical residency program yesterday who claimed that exact same cardiac tissue research. Her name was Ashley Wilson. She stated during her interview that it was her original groundbreaking work. I felt a cold calm wash over my entire body. The moment of truth had finally arrived. Ashley is my older sister. I stated the words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet boardroom. She and I shared a home computer in our parents' house. I knew she frequently read my personal files when I was not around. When I finalized the core algorithms for the cardiac tissue regeneration project, I knew she would try to take it. She has spent her entire life claiming my academic achievements as her own because my parents always enabled her. So I legally copyrighted the entire project under my birth name, Eleanor M. Wilson, 4 full months before she submitted it to your residency program. The board members exchanged horrified glances. The sharp-looking woman flipped furiously through her digital tablet, pulling up the admission records. So Ashley Wilson committed academic fraud? She asked, looking directly at me. She submitted stolen intellectual property. I replied, my voice echoing in the large room. My parents funded her expensive undergraduate degree and bought her every possible advantage, but they could not buy her the intellect to actually do the hard work. She took my files, hoping to secure her spot in your elite program. She thought I was too weak and too intimidated to stop her. She thought I would just quietly accept the theft like I always did when we were growing up. Dr. Thorne looked at my ruined, bleach-stained blazer and then looked directly into my eyes. And the jacket, Monica. He asked, his voice softening with sudden realization. Ashley poured concentrated bleach on my only professional blazer this morning to ensure I would miss this interview. I said, my voice completely steady, refusing to show any weakness. My mother watched her do it. She told me to stop making a scene and to stay home because I lacked the proper pedigree for medicine. She told me I belonged in a low-level laboratory, so I put the wet jacket on and I wore it anyway. The sheer audacity of my family's cruelty hung heavy in the air. I did not ask for their pity. I just presented the absolute unvarnished truth. Dr. Thorne slowly nodded, a look of profound respect replacing his initial confusion. He turned back to his colleagues. The board members were no longer looking at my ruined clothes or smelling the bleach. They were looking at the brilliant, resilient woman standing in front of them who had outsmarted her abusers. Dr. Thorne walked back to his seat, but he did not sit down. Eleanor or Monica, whichever you prefer, he said. I prefer Monica, I replied. Monica. He corrected himself. You possess exactly the kind of brilliant, analytical mind and unbreakable spirit this hospital desperately needs. The cardiac tissue algorithms you designed are decades ahead of current medical technology. If you are willing to let us license your intellectual property, we will not only fund your entire medical education, but we will offer you a full fellowship in our advanced surgical program, effective immediately. You will have your own lab, your own team, and our full backing. My heart soared. Everything I had worked for, every late night studying, every grueling overnight shift, serving coffee, had finally paid off. But I knew my toxic family better than anyone. If they found out about my sudden massive success, they would find a way to ruin it. They would demand access to my money. They would try to force me to surrender my fellowship position to Ashley to save her career. I will accept your generous offer, Dr. Thorne, I said, taking a step forward. But I have one strict non-negotiable condition. My identity as Eleanor M. Wilson, the author of the paper, and my placement in this fellowship program must remain absolutely secret. I need a ghost placement. No public announcements, no press releases. My family cannot know I am succeeding. They must continue to believe I am a failure. Dr. Thorne smiled, a genuine warm smile of understanding. We can arrange that without any issue, he said. And as for Ashley Wilson, her admission to our residency program is hereby officially revoked pending a full board investigation into her academic fraud. We do not tolerate thieves in this hospital. We shook hands across the table. The coarse, bleached fabric of my blazer rubbed painfully against my raw skin, but I felt absolutely no pain. I only felt sweet, undeniable victory. When I finally returned to the house, it was late afternoon. The sky was turning a bruised, heavy purple, matching the exhausted ache radiating through my muscles. I walked through the heavy oak front door and found my family gathered in the spacious living room. My father, Richard, had just returned from his exclusive golf club. He was sitting in his favorite chair, sipping a glass of expensive imported scotch. My mother was sitting next to him on the plush leather sofa, examining her freshly manicured nails. Ashley was pacing the hardwood floor, looking agitated and nervously checking her phone every few seconds. When they heard my footsteps and saw me walk into the room, Richard let out a loud, booming laugh. "Look who finally decided to show up," he mocked, gesturing at my ruined jacket with his crystal glass. "You look like a complete walking disaster, Monica. I assume the hospital security guards escorted you out the moment they smelled you coming through the lobby." I stood in the entryway, letting the heavy silence stretch between us. "I failed the interview," I said, my voice intentionally flat and defeated. "They took one look at me and told me to leave the premises immediately." Ashley let out a loud, dramatic sigh of profound relief. She slumped onto the sofa, smiling broadly. "Thank goodness," she sneered, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. "At least you did not completely drag our prestigious family name through the mud today. You never belonged in a place like that anyway, Monica. You are a diner waitress. That is all you will ever be. Stop trying to pretend you are smart enough to be a doctor." Richard stood up, his face hardening into a look of absolute disdain. "I am tired of looking at you, Monica," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You are a constant daily reminder of disappointment. You bring absolutely nothing to this family but embarrassment and shame. Your sister is about to start a luxury residency program and become a prominent, wealthy surgeon. We cannot have a pathetic failure living under the same roof. Pack your bags. I want you out of my house by tonight. You can go live on the streets for all I care." My mother did not say a single word in my defense. She simply picked up a glossy lifestyle magazine and started flipping through the pages, completely ignoring the fact that her husband was throwing her youngest daughter out into the cold night. I did not argue with them. I did not cry. I simply walked upstairs to my small, cramped bedroom and packed a single canvas duffel bag with my few remaining clothes and my laptop. I left the ruined, bleach-stained blazer hanging on the back of my bedroom door, a silent, lasting monument to their incredible cruelty. I walked down the stairs and out the front door into the cool evening air. I did not say goodbye to the people who were supposed to love me. I allowed them to believe they had successfully broken my spirit. I allowed them to sit in their expensive house and gloat about their manufactured superiority and their golden child. They had absolutely no idea that their precious golden child was about to lose everything she thought she had stolen. They had no idea that they had just handed me the ultimate freedom I needed. I walked into the dark night, the bright city lights welcoming me forward. I was completely alone in the world, but I had never felt more powerful or more alive. While they slept comfortably in their beds, dreaming of a false legacy, I was going to start building my massive empire in the shadows. I was going to let them choke on their own blinding arrogance. And when the time was right, when they were at their most vulnerable, I would return to take back everything they stole and burn their lies to the ground. 10 years is exactly how long it took to build my empire. Today, I am 33 years old. I am the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at the largest hospital network in the state. I hold 7 international biotech patents. My surgical tools are used in operating rooms across the globe. My net worth has surpassed figures my parents could only dream of. Yet if you saw me on the street, you would never know it. I drive a reliable 8-year-old beige sedan. I wear unbranded cotton shirts and simple slacks. I live in a beautiful but incredibly private estate, tucked away in the dense woods, far from the prying eyes of the local elite. I built my life in total secrecy because keeping my family entirely in the dark was the foundation of my ultimate strategy. To them, I am still exactly what they told me to be: a pathetic failure. a low-level laboratory technician barely scraping by on minimum wage. My father Richard and my sister Ashley had spent the last decade building their own kingdom. They founded the Wilson Wellness and Surgery Center. It is an ultra-exclusive private clinic catering to the absurdly wealthy. Richard provided the capital from our grandfather's trust fund, and Ashley provided the fabricated medical credentials. She was the face of the operation, parading around in tailored white coats and claiming to offer revolutionary surgical procedures. What the public did not know, what their wealthy clients did not know, was that Ashley was a complete fraud. She routinely botched minor procedures. She constantly misdiagnosed patients. Her entire medical career was a house of cards held together by my father's aggressive legal team and massive hush money payouts. For 10 years, I watched them from afar. I monitored their public filings. I tracked their aggressive marketing campaigns. I waited patiently as their arrogance blinded them to their own impending collapse. Then 2 weeks ago, I received an unexpected text message from my mother. It was a formal summons to a family Thanksgiving dinner at the Oakmont Country Club. I knew immediately that it was a trap. My family never invited me anywhere unless they wanted to use me as a prop to make themselves feel superior, or unless they needed a scapegoat for their own failures. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. The time for waiting was over. The Oakmont Country Club was a towering monument to old money and exclusivity. Huge stone pillars framed the entrance, and the driveway was lined with imported luxury vehicles. I pulled my faded beige sedan up to the valet stand. The young valet attendant looked at my car, and then looked at me with clear confusion. He hesitated before opening my door clearly, wondering if I had taken a wrong turn. I handed him my keys with a polite smile and walked up the wide marble steps into the grand lobby. The dining room was a sea of crystal chandeliers, white linen tablecloths, and wealthy families dressed in their holiday finest. I spotted my family immediately. They were holding court at a large circular table in the center of the room, demanding the attention of everyone around them. My mother Barbara was draped in heavy diamond jewelry and an expensive fur shawl. My father Richard was speaking loudly to a waiter, gesturing aggressively with a silver fork. Ashley sat between them, wearing a custom silk gown, her hair styled into perfect, pristine waves. They looked like the picture of absolute success. I walked over quietly, pulling out my own chair, because my father certainly was not going to do it for me. "Well, look who finally decided to join us," Richard announced, his voice carrying across the quiet dining room. Other patrons briefly turned to look before politely averting their eyes. "I see you are still dressing like you buy your clothes by the pound, Monica." I sat down and placed my simple canvas purse on my lap. "Happy Thanksgiving, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. Ashley leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. She looked me up and down with that same malicious smirk from 10 years ago. "It is really brave of you to show up here, Monica. I was sure the valet would mistake you for the kitchen staff. Are you still washing dirty test tubes for a living? I heard the laboratory you work at recently cut overtime hours. You must be really struggling to pay rent." "I work in a clinical lab," I replied, offering no details. "The work is steady." Barbara let out a dramatic theatrical sigh, signaling to the waiter to refill her champagne glass. "Steady is just a polite word for stagnant," she said, taking a long sip. "You really should look at your sister for inspiration, Monica. The Wilson Wellness Center just booked 3 high-profile celebrity clients this week alone. Ashley is practically running the private medical sector in this city. It is a shame you do not have her ambition." I picked up my water glass and took a sip, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat. I did not mention that my hospital network had recently treated 2 of Ashley's former clients for severe post-surgical infections. I did not mention that I had personally corrected a botched heart valve procedure that Ashley had completely mishandled. I simply nodded. "That is very impressive, Ashley." For the next 2 hours, I sat in silence and allowed them to use me as their personal punching bag. They needed an audience for their greatness, and they needed someone to look down on. They ordered with reckless, aggressive extravagance. Richard demanded 3 bottles of a vintage reserve champagne that cost hundreds of dollars each. Ashley ordered imported caviar truffles and the most expensive Wagyu beef on the menu. Barbara ordered a towering seafood platter, claiming she needed to celebrate her daughter's incredible genius. When the waiter asked for my order, I requested a simple house salad and a glass of sparkling water. Richard laughed loudly, slapping his hand on the heavy oak table. "Let her eat grass," he told the waiter. "Her palate is not refined enough for Wagyu anyway. Bring us another bottle of the reserve." They consumed plates of rich food and drained bottle after bottle of expensive wine. The conversation was a constant, endless loop of their own magnificence. They talked about buying a third vacation home in the Hamptons. They discussed upgrading Ashley's fleet of luxury vehicles. They bragged about their exclusive social circle. And every few minutes they would lob a cruel, cutting insult in my direction. They mocked my car. They mocked my hair. They mocked the fact that I was 33 and utterly alone in the world. I absorbed every insult with a calm, pleasant smile. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I sat perfectly still, analyzing their desperate need to perform. Real wealth whispers, but their wealth was screaming. And people only scream when they are terrified that no one is listening. As the dinner finally wound down, the head waiter approached our table. He was a tall, distinguished man in a crisp tuxedo. He carried a thick black leather folder holding the final bill. He stepped toward Richard, the obvious patriarch of the table, and extended the folder. Richard did not even look at the waiter. He casually waved his hand, pointing a thick finger across the table. "Give it to the lab tech," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. The waiter hesitated, looking uncertainly between my father and me. Ashley reached out, snatched the leather folder from the waiter's hand, and opened it. Her eyes scanned the itemized receipt. I knew exactly what the total was. With the vintage champagne, the imported caviar, and the Wagyu steaks, the bill easily surpassed $4,000. Ashley smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. She closed the leather folder and slid it slowly across the pristine white tablecloth directly until it stopped right in front of my plate. "You need to learn financial responsibility, Monica," Ashley said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You have been mooching off the family name for far too long. Consider paying this your rent for continuing to be a stain on our reputation. It is time you actually contributed something to this family instead of just dragging us down." Barbara nodded in enthusiastic agreement. "It will teach you the value of $1, Monica. Maybe it will finally motivate you to get a real job." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He was watching me intently, waiting for me to break. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to cry and beg. He wanted me to admit that I did not have $4,000 in my bank account. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire country club, forcing me to crawl to him for a handout so he could publicly reject me. The silence at the table grew heavy and suffocating. The waiter stood awkwardly nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamic playing out in front of him. I looked at the black leather folder. Then I looked up at my sister. Her eyes were bright with vicious joy. I looked at my mother, who was already looking away, dismissing me. I looked at my father, who was practically vibrating with anticipation. I did not argue. I did not point out the sheer absurdity of asking a supposed minimum wage lab technician to pay a $4,000 dinner bill. I did not mention that I had consumed exactly $14 worth of lettuce and water. I maintained absolute icy eye contact with my sister. I reached into my faded canvas purse. I bypassed my standard debit card and my regular credit cards. My fingers found the heavy, solid metal card tucked into the back slot of my wallet. It was a card completely devoid of limits, an invitation-only piece of hardware reserved exclusively for individuals with immense, massive capital. I pulled the solid black metal card from my purse. It caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, gleaming with quiet, absolute power. I did not say a single word. I simply picked up the leather folder, placed the heavy black card inside, and calmly handed it back to the waiting server. The waiter accepted the solid black card with a polite nod and walked away toward the billing station. The moment he was out of earshot, my mother Barbara let out a sharp, theatrical laugh. She leaned across the table, her heavy diamond necklace catching the warm light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Did you really just hand him a prop card, Monica?" Barbara asked, her voice dripping with pure condescension. "What is that?" Some fake metal novelty you bought online to impress your laboratory coworkers. You are going to embarrass us when his machine inevitably declines it. Ashley smirked, picking up her crystal champagne flute. Let her play pretend mom. It will be hilarious when the manager comes over to tell her she has insufficient funds. Maybe they will let her scrub the kitchen floors to work off the cost of the Wagyu beef. My father, Richard, crossed his arms over his chest, completely amused by my impending humiliation. You have always had a flair for the dramatic, Monica. But this is the real world. You cannot fake your way through a $4,000 tab at the Oakmont Country Club. I did not respond. I simply kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely neutral. I watched the heavy wooden dining room doors waiting. 5 minutes passed. The tension at our table grew thick. Ashley kept checking her phone, clearly waiting for the exact moment my failure would be publicly announced. Then the head waiter returned. He was not accompanied by a disgruntled manager or angry security guards. He was walking alone, holding my black metal card resting elegantly on a silver tray. He bypassed Richard entirely and stopped directly next to my chair. He bowed slightly, dipping his head in a gesture of profound respect that made my father instantly bristle in his seat. Dr. Monica, the waiter said, his voice projecting clearly across our silent table. The club owner, Mr. Sterling, sends his absolute deepest regards. He instructed me to return your card immediately. He has completely comped your entire table for the evening. He said to thank you personally for the life-saving bypass surgery you performed on his wife last month. He considers it an honor to have you dining in his establishment today. The waiter smiled warmly at me, set the zero-balance receipt on the table, and quietly walked away. The silence that slammed into our table was absolute. It was deafening. Ashley lowered her champagne flute so fast that the golden liquid splashed over the rim and stained the pristine white tablecloth. Her malicious smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. Barbara stared at me with her mouth slightly open, unable to process the words she had just heard. Doctor, she repeated the word as if it tasted foul. Why did that waiter call you a doctor? And who is Mr. Sterling? He is the billionaire real estate developer who owns this country club. I replied, my tone completely conversational. I repaired a severe aortic valve tear for his wife 4 weeks ago. It was a complex procedure, but she is recovering beautifully. Richard slapped his hand down hard on the heavy oak table, causing the silver cutlery to rattle loudly. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson. He could not stand the idea that I held any power or respect in a room where he desperately needed to feel like a king. That waiter is obviously an idiot, Richard snapped, glaring at the retreating figure. He confused you with an actual surgeon. You probably just draw the blood samples for the doctors who do the real work. Do not sit there and pretend you are performing bypass surgeries, Monica. We know exactly who you are. We know exactly what you do. I looked right into my father's eyes and let him hold on to his comfortable lie. If he wanted to believe the owner of the most exclusive country club in the state made a massive mistake, I would let him. His blinding arrogance was my greatest asset. Whether he made a mistake or not, I said softly, the bill is paid. You do not have to worry about my financial responsibility anymore, Dad. That was the exact wrong thing to say to a narcissist losing control. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and slammed it down onto the table directly on top of the zero-balance receipt. He ripped the envelope open and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. I am not here to play games with you tonight, Monica. Richard growled, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. Your grandfather left a substantial trust fund and a block of prime commercial real estate when he passed away last year. The estate was split between you and Ashley, but you have done absolutely nothing with your life to deserve that kind of capital. You are a low-level lab technician. You would just squander it on pointless things. Ashley leaned forward, her confidence returning now that they were back on their favorite subject. My wellness and surgery center is expanding rapidly, Monica. We are bringing in state-of-the-art equipment. We need that commercial property to build a new luxury recovery wing. Dad and I have already drawn up the transfer papers to make it happen. Richard pushed the heavy documents across the table, tapping his gold ring aggressively against the signature line at the bottom of the last page. "You are going to sign away your rights to the estate right now," Richard demanded. "You are going to transfer your entire half of the property directly to Ashley's corporate holding account. It is the only way to protect the family legacy and ensure the money is put to good use." Barbara chimed in, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. "It really is for the best, Monica. You do not know the first thing about managing a medical facility or handling massive real estate assets. Ashley is a brilliant doctor. She knows exactly how to maximize this investment. Just sign the papers and be a good, supportive sister for once in your life. Stop being so selfish." "And if I refuse?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. Richard leaned across the table, his face twisting into a mask of pure intimidation. "If you refuse to sign these papers tonight, you are no longer part of this family. I will officially disown you. I will cut you out of my will forever. I will make sure every single connection I have in this city knows that you are a greedy, ungrateful failure. You will be dead to us, Monica. You will have absolutely nothing." The threat hung heavily in the air. 10 years ago, that threat would have crushed me. 10 years ago, the thought of losing my family would have sent me into a desperate panic. But 10 years ago, I did not know that they were nothing but parasites feeding off my insecurities. They had spent my entire life making me feel small so they could feel gigantic. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents. I slowly reached out and picked them up. I could hear Ashley let out a quiet, triumphant breath. She thought she had won. She thought the mere threat of abandonment was enough to break my spirit and force my compliance. I opened my purse and took out a heavy silver pen. My parents watched me with smug satisfaction. They were so incredibly certain of their dominance. They really believed I was a broken, terrified woman who would gladly hand over millions of dollars just to keep their toxic love. I placed the pen on the table, but I did not bring it anywhere near the signature line. Instead, I flipped past the cover page. I ignored the summary of asset transfers. I flipped directly to page 14, the dense section detailing the assumption of corporate liabilities. I smoothed the page out flat against the table. "This is a very interesting contract, Dad," I said, tracing my finger down the complex legal jargon that they assumed I could not understand. "You structured this as a full corporate merger of assets. You are not just asking me to hand over grandfather's real estate. You are asking me to merge my half of the trust directly into the primary holding company of the Wilson Wellness Center. It is standard legal procedure." Richard snapped impatiently, looking around the room to make sure no one was listening. "Just sign the paper, Monica, and stop stalling. It would be standard if the clinic was solvent." I replied, my voice dropping to a clinical icy calm. "But if I sign this document, I also assume equal responsibility for the existing corporate debt of the holding company." Ashley's smile faltered. Her eyes darted nervously toward my father. Barbara looked confused, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. I tapped my silver pen against Section 4, Paragraph B. "You do not want this property for an expansion, Dad. You do not have the capital to build a new recovery wing. You want me to sign this because the Wilson Wellness Center is currently drowning in $12 million of high-interest commercial debt. And worse than that, you need my clean financial record because the clinic is currently facing a massive federal audit by the IRS. Are you not?" Richard's face drained of color. The deep crimson flush of anger vanished, replaced by the sickly pale shade of a man who realized he was completely exposed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the silver pen tapping rhythmically against the lethal clause hidden deep within his deceptive contract. Ashley looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the heavy oak table so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. She knew about the debt. I could see it in her terrified eyes. She knew their pristine surgical center was nothing more than a hollow, rotting shell on the verge of total financial collapse. Barbara, however, chose a completely different tactic. She was a creature of high society, and her instinct for self-preservation in public spaces was ruthless. She looked around the quiet, elegant dining room of the Oakmont Country Club and realized that the surrounding tables were actively listening. The elite families of the city were watching the mighty Wilsons unravel over a stack of legal documents and a comped dinner bill. Barbara stood up abruptly. Her heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the polished floor, the harsh sound slicing through the refined atmosphere. "Oh, you poor sick girl," Barbara announced, her voice pitched unnaturally high so it would carry across the entire room. She pressed a hand dramatically to her chest, putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Richard, we need to get her help immediately. I told you she was not stable enough to join us tonight. She is having another one of her mental breakdowns." Patrons at the neighboring tables murmured in hushed tones, throwing sympathetic glances toward my mother and deeply suspicious looks at me. "Monica, please lower your voice," Barbara pleaded, even though I had not raised my voice above a calm, clinical whisper. "You are completely delusional. We just wanted to have a nice Thanksgiving dinner, and now you are making up these wild, paranoid fantasies about the IRS and $12 million. You are scaring your sister. We just want to get you into a psychiatric facility so you can get the help you so desperately need. Do not try to extort us again." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She was using the exact same tactic they had used when I was a teenager. Whenever I pointed out their cruelty, they claimed I was unstable. Whenever I demanded fairness, they claimed I was hysterical. They relied on making me look crazy so they would never have to be held accountable. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not engage in a screaming match to prove my sanity to a room full of strangers who did not care about me. I slowly picked up my solid black metal card from the leather folder and slid it back into my faded canvas purse. I gathered my coat and stood up, looking directly into my mother's panicked, performing eyes. "You can keep the unexecuted contract, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through Barbara's theatrical sobbing. "You will need the scratch paper when the federal auditors seize your computers." I turned away from the table. "Wait!" Richard snapped, panic finally breaking through his paralysis. The waiter comped the meal, "Monica. But what about the tip? It is customary to leave 20% at the Oakmont. You cannot just walk out." I paused and looked back at the three of them sitting in the wreckage of their ruined Thanksgiving dinner. "The club owner comped my meal," I said pleasantly. "He did not comp the gratuity for the $4,000 worth of imported Wagyu and vintage champagne you aggressively demanded. Since you are the titans of industry, I am sure you can cover the tip. Consider it your rent for continuing to be a stain on the medical profession." I walked out of the grand dining room, leaving them sitting in stunned, furious silence. The retaliation began before I even woke up the next morning. My family operated like a highly organized syndicate when their reputation was threatened. They could not afford for anyone to believe my claims about their impending financial ruin, so they launched a scorched earth smear campaign to discredit me entirely. I spent the next 3 days watching the fabricated narrative spread like wildfire through our hometown. My phone, a secondary device I kept active purely to monitor their behavior, began buzzing with alerts. Extended relatives who had ignored me for a decade suddenly flooded my inbox with accusatory messages. My Aunt Patricia sent a lengthy text lecturing me about elder abuse and stating she was praying for my psychiatric recovery. My cousin David left a voicemail demanding I apologize for trying to blackmail my own father during a holiday dinner. Ashley took to her highly curated social media accounts. She posted a tearful, soft-lit video explaining how difficult it was to love a family member struggling with severe mental illness. She talked about the heartbreaking reality of dealing with a sister who suffered from paranoid delusions and attempted extortion. She claimed I had shown up at their private dinner, screamed aggressively at the staff, and demanded millions of dollars in exchange for not spreading malicious lies about her clinic. She disabled the comments, framing it as a brave attempt to protect her peace while she focused on healing her patients. It was a brilliant, vicious strategy. By painting me as an unhinged extortionist sister, they inoculated themselves against any future leaks regarding their IRS audit or their massive debt. If the truth ever came out, they had already primed the public to believe it was just the vindictive rambling of a crazy relative. I sat in my home office, sipping hot coffee and watching the digital performance unfold. I did not issue a single denial. I did not post a rebuttal. I simply gathered screenshots, downloaded the videos, and forwarded everything to my private legal team. Every public lie they told was another shovel full of dirt they were digging for their own grave. On Tuesday morning, I stopped at a small independent coffee shop near the hospital network to review a quarterly biotech patent report before my surgical rounds. The shop was quiet, smelling of roasted beans and damp rain. I was sitting at a corner table wearing my usual unbranded gray sweater and simple denim jeans. I felt a looming presence before I saw him. "Monica," a smooth, heavily polished voice announced. I looked up from my laptop. Standing over my small table was Bradley. He was Ashley's wealthy, arrogant fiancé. He was a junior partner at a prominent private equity firm, a man who wore custom Italian suits and possessed an ego roughly the size of a small country. He slid into the chair across from me without asking for permission, adjusting his silk tie and looking at my modest clothing with undisguised contempt. "Hello, Bradley," I said, closing my laptop. "To what do I owe the displeasure?" He chuckled a dry, condescending sound. "Always so hostile, Monica. I am actually here to help you. Your family is devastated by your little stunt at the country club. You really humiliated yourself. Ashley has been crying for days about your mental decline. But I am a practical man, and I prefer practical solutions to messy emotional problems." He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a crisp, heavy checkbook. He unscrewed a gold fountain pen and began writing. "Your father told me about the commercial real estate from your grandfather's trust." Bradley said, his tone incredibly patronizing. "He mentioned you are refusing to sign the corporate merger documents because you are confused about the clinic's liabilities. I get it. You are a lab technician. High-level corporate finance is intimidating when you barely make enough to pay your heating bill." He tore the check from the book and slid it across the wooden table. "It was made out to me for exactly $50,000. Take the money, Monica," Bradley ordered, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Sign the merger papers today. $50,000 is a fortune for someone living your lifestyle. It will pay off whatever credit card debt you have, and maybe let you buy a car that was not manufactured in the last decade. Just take the payout, drop this ridiculous extortion attempt against your sister, and know your place." I pushed the $50,000 check across the table. "You failed to calculate the clinic's depreciating assets against their $12 million liability, Bradley," I stated, picking up my coffee. "Their long-term debt-to-equity ratio is entirely catastrophic. The real estate merger you proposed would trigger an immediate default under standard federal tax guidelines. I know the reality of high-level corporate mergers much better than you ever will. Go back to your little office and do the basic math." Bradley stared at me. The condescending smirk melted off his face, replaced by a rigid mask of absolute shock. He looked down at the $50,000 check lying on the table between us, then back up at my face. He opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but his usual corporate arrogance completely failed him. He knew I was right. I had just dismantled his entire financial strategy with a few sentences over a cup of coffee. He grabbed the check and shoved it back into his tailored jacket, his hands shaking with sudden, uncontained rage. "You think you are so smart, Monica," Bradley sneered, his voice dropping its polished veneer and taking on a nasty, desperate edge. "You think rattling off some tax code makes you a player. But you are just a bitter, lonely lab tech trying to sabotage your own sister. It does not matter if the clinic has a few temporary liabilities. Richard and Ashley do not need your useless half of the estate anyway. We already have a massive exit strategy." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting him talk. Desperate men always talk too much when their ego is bruised. They cannot handle being corrected by someone they consider beneath them. "We are finalizing a buyout," Bradley bragged, leaning over the small wooden table. "A complete acquisition by the largest hospital network in the state. They are going to pay $20 million for the clinic and Ashley's proprietary surgical technology. Your family is about to become untouchable. You could have had a small piece of that if you just played nice. Now you get to spend the rest of your pathetic life washing test tubes while we buy our fourth vacation home." I set my coffee cup down. I stood up and slung my canvas bag over my shoulder. "Good luck with the acquisition, Bradley," I said, my tone perfectly pleasant. I hear the hospital network's board of directors is exceptionally thorough when it comes to vetting proprietary technology. Make sure your math is better than it was today. I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him fuming in the corner booth. He thought he had put me in my place. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me the exact blueprint of their destruction. I drove my beige sedan straight to the underground executive parking garage of the state's largest medical complex. I bypassed the crowded main entrance and took the private secure elevator up to the top floor. I walked past the heavy glass doors bearing my name and title. Dr. Monica Wilson, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. My assistant handed me a thick leather binder the moment I stepped into my spacious office. The acquisition proposal from the Wilson Wellness Center had finally landed on my desk for final executive review. As the chief of surgery and the head of the hospital's Biotech Innovation Board, every single medical acquisition required my direct authorized signature. My family was trying to sell their failing clinic to my hospital network. They just had absolutely no idea it was my hospital. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk and opened the binder. I skipped past the inflated patient metrics and the fraudulent revenue projections. I knew Richard had cooked the books to hide the $12 million in IRS debt. I flipped directly to the intellectual property section. Bradley had mentioned Ashley's proprietary surgical technology. I needed to see exactly what they were trying to sell us. I stared at the glossy schematic printed on the heavy, high-quality paper. My blood ran completely cold. Then a dark, cynical smile spread across my face. It was a specialized titanium retractor designed for minimally invasive valve replacements. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary. And it was mine. I designed that exact surgical tool a decade ago during my final year of medical school. I had spent months perfecting the angles, calculating the precise torque needed to reduce tissue damage during complex surgeries. I had kept the original blueprints in a locked drawer in my childhood bedroom. When my family threw me out of the house after my sister poured bleach on my interview blazer, I had packed in a hurry. I left those initial rough sketches behind. I always assumed my mother had thrown them in the trash. Instead, Ashley had found them. She had kept them hidden for 10 years, waiting for the perfect moment to claim my genius as her own. Now she was trying to sell my stolen intellectual property to my own hospital to save herself from federal prison. The absolute sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She truly believed she could steal from me forever without any consequences. I spent the next 2 hours diving deep into the clinic's financial disclosures. The desperation practically bled through the ink on the pages. Richard had leveraged every single asset he owned to keep the wellness center afloat. He had taken out massive predatory loans using his personal home as collateral. He had funneled money from questionable offshore accounts to cover the operational losses caused by Ashley's profound medical incompetence. The IRS audit was not just a minor inconvenience. It was a targeted criminal investigation into massive tax fraud and embezzlement. If they did not secure this $20 million buyout by the end of the week, the federal government would completely seize the clinic. Richard and Ashley would face immediate public indictment. They would lose their country club memberships, their luxury cars, and their freedom. They were backed into a corner. They had no cash reserves. They had no leverage left. They were banking their entire freedom on the illusion that Ashley was a medical pioneer. They believed the hospital network would be so blinded by the revolutionary surgical tool that they would rush the acquisition through without a deep forensic audit. They expected a quick payout, a clean escape, and a massive unearned payday. They thought they had found the perfect golden parachute. I closed the leather binder and pressed the intercom button on my large desk. I told my assistant to schedule the final acquisition signing for this afternoon in the main executive boardroom. I told her to ensure the entire hospital board of directors was present. I wanted every single prominent medical professional in the building to witness exactly what was about to happen. I wanted the legal team standing by. I wanted the financial auditors in the room. This was not going to be a quiet rejection. This was going to be a highly publicized execution. I walked over to my private suite attached to the office. I took off the cheap, unbranded cotton shirt and the faded denim jeans. I stripped away the pathetic lab tech disguise I had worn for the last 10 days. I put on a tailored charcoal gray designer suit. I slipped on a pair of diamond stud earrings and fastened a heavy platinum watch around my wrist. I looked in the full-length mirror. The struggling, discarded daughter was gone. The titan of industry was finally ready to work. As I was reviewing the final legal traps I had instructed our corporate lawyers to plant in the buyout contract, my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. I picked it up. It was a text message from Ashley. She could not resist gloating. She was too arrogant, too desperate for validation to simply walk away in silence. She needed to twist the knife one last time to assure herself that she was the undeniable winner. She needed to make sure I felt small so she could feel enormous. The message popped up on the bright screen. "We are signing a $20 million buyout today, Monica. Dad and I are securing our legacy. You had your chance to be a part of this family, and you ruined it by being so stubborn. Now you get absolutely nothing. Go back to your dirty little apartment and enjoy your miserable life." I read the words twice. I could picture her perfectly manicured hands typing the message. I could picture her standing in the grand lobby of my hospital wearing a stolen white coat, completely unaware that she was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. She thought she had outsmarted everyone. She thought she was hours away from ultimate untouchable wealth. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was completely worthless. They mocked my ambition and actively tried to destroy my future. Now it was my turn to show them what happens when you deeply underestimate a woman who builds her own power. I grabbed my phone. I did not block her number. I did not respond with anger or defensive justifications. I simply typed a single short reply. "I will see you at the signing." I stood perfectly still in the shadowed alcove of the executive security hub. My arms were crossed tightly across my chest as I watched the high-definition surveillance monitors. The glowing live feed from the primary lobby displayed the exact moment my toxic family arrived. They moved together as a single imposing unit. They treated the crowded hospital entrance like a grand stage designed solely for their performance. They had dressed for a complete coronation. Richard led the charge wearing a bespoke navy suit that screamed old money. His chin was tilted up aggressively, as if the polished marble floors of the hospital were his personal runway. He barked an aggressive order at a passing porter, without even bothering to look the young man in the eye. Barbara strutted right beside him in a pristine cream pantsuit with a heavy string of expensive pearls resting against her collarbone. She clutched a designer handbag like a protective shield. She offered small, condescending smiles to the nurses and administrators who turned to look at the massive commotion. She clearly thought they were staring in pure awe of the great Wilson family. They were actually staring because Richard was loudly complaining about parking and the hospital's severe lack of a dedicated VIP valet service. Ashley walked half a step ahead of them both. She wore an immaculately tailored bright white coat over a sharp black pencil skirt. It was entirely a costume. She was desperately playing the role of the brilliant surgeon and medical visionary. She carried a sleek leather briefcase gripped tightly in her manicured hand. Inside that dark briefcase was the stolen intellectual property and the schematic she had ripped from my childhood bedroom. She believed that briefcase was her $20 million ticket to absolute freedom and absolute salvation from federal prison and total financial ruin. I watched them completely bypass the main receptionist desk. Richard did not believe in waiting for any permission. He pushed violently through the secondary security doors with the blazing entitlement of a man who firmly believed he owned the entire building. I watched the glowing monitors as they marched directly toward the executive boardroom. A cold and heavy calm settled deeply over my chest. I turned away from the bright screens and smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal gray designer suit. I finally began the long walk down the empty executive corridor entirely. Inside the grand boardroom, the space was deliberately intimidating. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, sweeping view of the city's skyline, casting long afternoon shadows across the polished wood. At the far end of the heavy table sat Marcus Vance, the hospital network's chief executive officer. He was flanked by 3 senior board members and 2 top-tier corporate attorneys. They were waiting in complete total silence. Richard, arrogant as always, did not bother to knock before entering. The heavy oak doors burst open as he shoved his way violently into the room. He strode in with absolute blind confidence, tossing his luxury overcoat carelessly onto a nearby empty chair. Marcus Richard boomed, extending a hand across the long table with manufactured booming warmth. "It is good to see you. Let us skip the formalities and get straight to serious business today. My brilliant daughter has high-profile surgeries scheduled for this afternoon, and we simply do not have the valuable time to waste on endless bureaucratic pleasantries. Let us finalize this lucrative deal right now." Marcus did not take the offered hand. He remained firmly seated with his hands folded neatly on top of a thick, detailed legal binder. He looked at Richard with a flat, entirely unreadable expression. The absolute silence in the grand room stretched thick and deeply uncomfortable. "Take a seat, Richard," Marcus finally said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 freezing degrees. "We are currently waiting for one final executive signature before we can proceed with the acquisition review." Ashley scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. She pulled out a large leather chair near the head of the table and sat down tightly, crossing her legs. She placed her leather briefcase on the polished wood with a loud, aggressive thud, resting her hand protectively on top of it. "Who else do we possibly need to wait for?" Ashley demanded, her tone dripping with toxic impatience and inflated self-importance. "You have the creator of the revolutionary technology sitting right here in front of you. I am handing your hospital the entire future of cardiothoracic surgery on a silver platter. My patent alone will triple the value of your entire surgical department overnight. We agreed on $20 million. Have your legal team slide the buyout papers over so we can finalize this transaction. I have a wellness center to run and desperate patients waiting." Barbara took the chair next to Ashley, nodding in aggressive agreement. She smoothed the creases of her cream slacks and gave Marcus a highly patronizing look. "Time is money," Mr. Vance, Barbara said smoothly, her voice echoing the practiced cadence of a high society matron. "The Wilson Wellness Center is highly sought after across the state. We have other aggressive buyers waiting in the wings who would kill for this technology. If your hospital network is not prepared to close the deal today, we will simply take our revolutionary intellectual property elsewhere. We only gave you the first right of refusal out of professional courtesy because we deeply respect your fine institution. Do not make us regret our immense generosity." The 2 corporate attorneys sitting next to Marcus exchanged brief, heavily amused glances. Marcus leaned back slowly in his chair, completely unfazed by the hollow, desperate threats my family was projecting. He knew about the IRS. He knew about the staggering debt. "You will not be taking this intellectual property anywhere," Barbara Marcus replied, his tone dangerously calm and deeply serious. "Because the specific terms of this monumental acquisition require a unanimous authorized vote from our hospital's Biotech Innovation Board. And the head of that board is walking through those doors right now." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. I stepped directly into the room. The cheap denim jeans and the faded oversized sweaters were entirely gone. I wore my sharply tailored charcoal gray designer suit. The precise cut of the expensive fabric armored me perfectly against their cruel judgment. My posture was completely straight. My chin was leveled perfectly toward them, and my facial expression was entirely devoid of any readable emotion. I carried the exact same heavy leather binder my assistant had handed me earlier that morning. I did not look like the exhausted, discarded lab technician they had gleefully mocked at the Oakmont Country Club. I did not look like the broken daughter they had bullied and manipulated my entire life. I looked like a powerful woman who commanded the room. Because I did. The reaction from my treacherous family was instantaneous and utterly explosive. Richard shot up from his leather chair so fast it tipped backward and slammed violently into the glass wall behind him. His face turned an alarming mottled shade of crimson purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged visibly against his starched white collar, his hands clenched into tight, aggressive fists at his sides. "What the hell are you doing here, Monica?" Richard roared, his furious voice bouncing harshly off the floor to ceiling glass windows. Barbara gasped loudly, pressing a trembling hand to her heavy pearl necklace, as if she had just witnessed a ghost walk through the double doors. She looked frantically around the expansive boardroom, her eyes darting toward the hospital executives, clearly expecting someone to immediately throw me out into the street. Ashley lost her mind completely. Her confident, arrogant facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. She leaped to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She pointed a shaking, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with manic disbelief. "How did you get past security?" Ashley shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the confined, quiet space of the boardroom. "Who let her in here? She does not belong anywhere near this building. Call security right now." Marcus Ashley commanded, her voice vibrating with panic and furious entitlement. "This woman is a delusional lab tech. She wandered into an executive meeting. Get her out." At her. Marcus Vance did not reach for the telephone. He did not signal for the guards. Instead, he slowly stood up from his heavy leather chair. The other board members and corporate attorneys instantly followed his lead, rising to their feet in a unified gesture of profound, undeniable professional respect. Marcus looked at Ashley with an expression of pure freezing ice. "Security," Marcus asked coldly. "Dr. Monica is the majority shareholder of this network. You are sitting in her chair." The silence that followed Marcus Vance's statement was absolute. It was the kind of suffocating quiet that only exists in the exact second before a catastrophic impact. No one breathed. No one moved. The air in the executive boardroom turned to solid ice. Richard stood frozen against the glass wall. His jaw hung slightly open, making him look entirely foolish rather than intimidating. The deep crimson color had completely vanished from his face, leaving behind a sickly ash-gray pallor. Barbara looked as though she had been physically struck. Her hand remained clawed around her heavy pearl necklace, her knuckles stark white against her collarbone. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, unable to process the reality unfolding right in front of her. Ashley was trembling. Her entire body shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The arrogant mask of the brilliant surgeon completely dissolved. She looked right down at the heavy leather chair she had just aggressively claimed, the chair belonging to the majority shareholder, the chair belonging to me. "Move, Ashley," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a surgical scalpel. She did not argue. She did not scream. She stumbled backward, her knees buckling slightly as she scrambled away from the head of the table. She practically tripped over her own expensive heels, retreating to the far corner of the room like a frightened child. I walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. My charcoal suit moved perfectly with my stride. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my sister. I walked directly to the head of the heavy mahogany table and sat down. I placed my leather binder on the polished wood. Marcus Vance and the other board members remained standing until I was fully seated, a gesture of profound respect that made my father visibly flinch. Once I was settled, the rest of the executives took their seats. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally, permanently shifted. I was no longer the discarded daughter begging for scraps of affection. I was the executioner. Now, I began folding my hands neatly on top of the binder. "Let us discuss this highly lucrative acquisition you are so desperate to finalize today." Richard finally found his voice. It came out as a weak, raspy croak. "Monica, what is this? What kind of sick game are you playing with us? How did you get control of this hospital?" I did not answer his irrelevant questions. I was not there to explain my decade of silent, grueling labor. I was not there to narrate the sleepless nights, the massive investments, the strategic corporate maneuvers that led me to owning the majority stake in the most profitable medical network in the state. I was there to close a trap. I unclasped the leather binder and flipped it open. I pulled out a thick, heavy file entirely filled with complex legal documents and highly technical schematic diagrams. I pushed the file across the smooth surface of the table, stopping it directly in front of Marcus. You presented a $20 million valuation for the Wilson Wellness Center, I stated, keeping my tone completely clinical. You claimed that valuation was entirely justified by a revolutionary proprietary surgical technology, a specialized titanium retractor designed for minimally invasive valve replacements. You told my board of directors that Dr. Ashley Wilson personally designed and engineered this groundbreaking medical device. Ashley let out a small, pathetic whimper from the corner of the room. She wrapped her arms tightly around her waist, physically shrinking under my gaze. I looked directly at my sister. The pristine white coat she wore suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. You always were a terrible liar, Ashley, I said smoothly. You lack the fundamental intelligence required to maintain a complex deception. You brought a stolen blueprint to a room full of the top medical minds in the country and expected us to simply hand you a blank check. Barbara finally snapped out of her shocked paralysis. She rushed forward, playing the protective matriarch. Stop this right now, Monica, Barbara demanded, her voice shaking with deep anger. You are jealous of your sister's brilliant medical mind. She worked tirelessly on that retractor. You are just using your position to bully her and steal her glory. You are a bitter, vindictive girl. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my binder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment paper bearing the official gold seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Let us talk about this brilliant medical mind, I replied, sliding the official document across the table. Let us talk about the exact origin of this magnificent invention you are trying to sell me. Richard lunged forward, bracing his hands heavily on the table. He stared down at the official patent document. His eyes frantically scanned the dense legal text, searching for any loophole, any mistake, any possible way out of the devastating reality he was facing. That specific surgical retractor design belongs to me, I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the massive boardroom. I engineered it. I mathematically proved the torque limits. I registered the intellectual property. I patented it under my legal name 10 years ago. I watched the exact moment my father realized his entire financial rescue plan was built on stolen property. His shoulders sagged heavily. The aggressive posture completely collapsed. He looked like a defeated, broken old man. You remember 10 years ago, do you not, Ashley? I asked, shifting my gaze back to my terrified sister. I remember it very clearly. I was in my final year of medical school. I was working 90-hour weeks, living on black coffee and sheer willpower. I had just secured the most prestigious surgical residency in the state. You were so consumed with jealousy that you snuck into my childhood bedroom and poured industrial bleach all over my interview blazer. Ashley squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look at me. My parents threw me out of the house that same night. I continued the memory playing out perfectly in my mind. You told them I was hysterical. You told them I ruined my own clothes for attention. They believed you. They always believed you. I packed my entire life into garbage bags and left. But I was in a hurry. I left behind my initial rough sketches for the retractor hidden in my desk drawer. I assumed they were thrown away with the rest of the trash you deemed unworthy of the Wilson family home. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the heavy table. But you did not throw them away, did you, Ashley? You kept them. You hid them for a decade. And when your clinic started drowning in $12 million of high-interest commercial debt, when the IRS auditors started circling your fraudulent bank accounts, you panicked. You needed a miracle to save you from federal prison. You dug out my old sketches, slapped your name on them, and tried to sell them to my hospital network for $20 million. You are committing massive corporate fraud, Dad, I said, turning my attention back to Richard. You are attempting to sell stolen intellectual property to a major medical network. That is a severe federal crime. Barbara began to cry loudly. Actual genuine tears of pure terror spilled down her perfectly powdered cheeks. Richard, please do something. Barbara sobbed, clutching his arm. She is going to destroy us. She is going to send us to jail. Tell them she is lying. Tell them Ashley invented it. Richard was sweating profusely. Large, heavy drops of perspiration formed on his forehead and rolled down his neck, staining his expensive silk collar. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had completely snapped shut around him. His entire legacy, his entire carefully constructed illusion of wealth and superiority, was disintegrating in front of the most powerful elite executives in the city. He could not accept defeat. His malignant narcissism simply would not allow him to surrender to the daughter he had spent 30 years tearing down. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand and stood up straight, forcing a nasty, vicious sneer onto his face. "You are bluffing, Monica." Richard growled, his voice echoing harshly against the glass walls. "You think flashing a fake piece of paper changes anything? You cannot prove that patent is yours. You cannot prove Ashley stole anything from your room. We have original design documents. We have initial sketches and dated computer files proving Ashley created this technology from scratch. We have physical documents dating back 10 years. You have nothing but a vindictive imagination." I looked at my desperate, sweating father. I looked at the man who had mocked my existence and tried to destroy my future. I leaned back comfortably in my heavy leather chair and smiled coldly. "Let us check the timestamps." I opened the leather binder flat against the mahogany table and extracted a sealed digital forensics report. I slid it over to Marcus Vance. The hospital's CEO broke the seal and spread the documents out for the entire board of directors to see. I did not just patent the device 10 years ago. I stated, my voice perfectly level. I logged every single digital stroke of its creation on the university's secure server during my surgical residency. The timestamp on my original computer-aided design files predates your earliest clinic records by exactly 3 years and 4 months. You did not just steal a physical drawing, Ashley. You stole a heavily encrypted digital footprint that the United States Patent Office has fully authenticated. Marcus Vance adjusted his glasses and looked up from the forensics report. He turned his icy gaze toward Richard. "The metadata is absolute, Mr. Wilson." Marcus said, his tone conveying pure corporate disgust. "You brought stolen intellectual property into a major hospital network and attempted to sell it for $20 million. Our legal team will be filing a formal report with the federal authorities by the end of the business day." Richard was hyperventilating. He looked at the heavy oak doors, measuring the distance as if calculating whether he could physically run away. Barbara remained frozen in her seat, her jaw working silently. "But the stolen patent is just the beginning." I continued, tapping my finger against the thick binder. "The patent was just the shiny bait you used to distract us from the actual rotting carcass of the Wilson Wellness Center. You wanted this buyout to bury your liabilities. But in your desperate rush for a golden parachute, you invited my board to look deep into your operational metrics." I reached into the binder again and pulled out a secondary stack of documents printed on bright red paper. I distributed them down the length of the long table. The corporate attorneys leaned forward, immediately scanning the red pages with predatory interest. Ashley let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She recognized the red paper. It was the internal coding system for severe surgical complications at her own clinic. "Let us talk about your brilliant medical career, Ashley," I announced, folding my hands neatly in front of me. "Let us discuss exactly what we would be acquiring if we absorbed your surgical center. You claim to be a visionary. You claim your clinic provides elite care to the wealthiest citizens in the state. But these files paint an entirely different picture." I looked directly at the hospital board. "Dr. Ashley Wilson has a severe complication rate of 24% on routine cardiothoracic procedures." I stated clearly, allowing the horrifying statistic to sink into the quiet room. "The national average is less than 2%. A collective gasp rippled through the hospital executives. The chief of medical ethics covered his mouth with his hand. "You are butchering people, Ashley," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh clinical whisper. "You are performing highly complex operations that you completely lack the fundamental skill to execute. You have settled 7 massive malpractice lawsuits out of court in the last 3 years alone, and those settlements were quietly paid, using the operating budget of the clinic, effectively draining the center of all liquid capital." "That is confidential," Ashley screamed, slamming her hands on the table. "You hacked into our private server. That is a federal crime." "No, Ashley," I corrected smoothly. "You handed us those servers. When you aggressively pushed for an expedited $20 million acquisition, you signed a standard corporate discovery waiver. You literally gave my financial auditors complete, unrestricted access to your internal databases. You were so blinded by the prospect of a massive payout that you forgot to lock the back door. You handed me the murder weapon. Ashley collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her trembling hands. The pristine white coat she wore suddenly looked like a mocking joke. She was not a surgeon. She was a liability. I shifted my gaze from my sobbing sister directly to my parents. They sat shoulder to shoulder, but they had never looked further apart. Richard was completely pale, sweating through his expensive, tailored suit. Barbara was staring at the red papers on the table as if they were venomous snakes about to strike her. "You knew she was incompetent," I said, addressing my parents. "You knew she was a profound danger to every patient she touched, but you let her keep operating. You let her keep cutting into human beings because you could not bear the public embarrassment of a failed golden child." I leaned forward, locking eyes with my father. "You bought Ashley's medical degree with the trust fund Granddad left for both of us." I stated the truth, ringing loud and clear across the boardroom. "But you could not buy her competence." Richard flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. "You drained the estate to build that clinic so Ashley could play doctor without any real oversight." I continued, relentlessly exposing the foundation of their entire existence. "You rigged the system for her. You paid off administrators. You covered up her horrific mistakes. You created a massive multi-million-dollar medical facility just to serve as a vanity project for a daughter who could not even pass her board certification exams on the first 3 attempts." Barbara let out a sharp, panicked sob. "Monica, please stop." She begged, her voice high and thin. "We are family. You are destroying your own family. You destroyed yourselves." I replied, my tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "I simply turned on the lights and let everyone see the wreckage. You stole my inheritance to fund her delusion, and when the money finally ran out, you tried to steal my invention to pay off the debt. You built an entire empire on my back while telling the world I was a failure." I picked up a small remote control from the table and pointed it at the massive smart screen dominating the front wall of the boardroom. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of blind patient outcome reports. The data was scrubbed of identifying personal information, but the surgical metrics were explicitly detailed in stark high-contrast charts. "Look at the screen, Dad," I commanded. "Look at what you paid for." The chart showed a devastating, deeply horrifying trend. Prolonged operating times, massive blood loss, severe post-operative infections, and a mortality rate that made the hospital board members shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The data was undeniable. It was a clear clinical map of pure professional negligence. "This is not just financial fraud," I announced, gesturing to the glowing screen. "This is a massive public health crisis. You allowed an unqualified, dangerously inept surgeon to operate on vulnerable people. Every single red spike on that graph represents a human life that was ruined or ended because you wanted to play country club royalty. You are not just bankrupt, Richard. You are a danger to the public." Marcus Vance steepled his fingers and looked at my father with deep, profound disgust. "Dr. Monica is absolutely correct," Marcus said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Our hospital network will not be acquiring the Wilson Wellness Center. We will not be assuming your $12 million tax debt. We will not be purchasing your stolen patent. Instead, our legal department will be forwarding this entire dossier, including the patient outcome reports and the evidence of intellectual property theft, directly to the State Medical Board and the Federal Prosecutor Office. Your clinic is finished." The finality of the CEO statement hit the room like a physical shockwave. The $20 million buyout, the golden parachute, the escape plan, it was all completely dead. Richard stared at the glowing screen, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The reality of his impending destruction finally crashed through his monumental ego. He was going to lose his country club membership, his mansion, his luxury cars, and his freedom. Federal prison was no longer a distant theoretical threat. It was a concrete reality waiting for him at the end of the week. He suddenly turned entirely on Barbara, his face contorted with vicious panic. "This is entirely all of your own fault." Richard screamed loudly, spittle flying from his lips. You insisted we keep paying off the malpractice settlements. You told me to use the offshore accounts to hide the losses. You made me sign those tax documents. Barbara physically recoiled, her own panic transforming instantly into pure venomous survival instinct. Do not you dare blame me, Richard! Barbara shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at him. You are the one who managed the corporate books. You are the one who insisted we leverage the house to keep the clinic open. I am not going to any federal prison because you are an entirely incompetent, pathetic businessman. Barbara's shrill voice bounced aggressively off the thick glass walls of the executive boardroom. She had completely abandoned her husband in a frantic, desperate bid for her own survival. Richard stared at his wife with an expression of profound disbelief. The wealthy, unified front they had projected for decades evaporated in a matter of seconds. The immediate threat of federal prison had stripped away their expensive veneer and exposed the absolute cowardice underneath. Richard realized in that freezing moment that Barbara would gladly testify against him to save herself. He was entirely alone. He shifted his terrified gaze away from his wife and looked down at his daughter. Ashley was still trembling in her chair, visibly shrinking under the weight of her exposed medical fraud. Richard made a rapid, ruthless calculation. He possessed zero loyalty. He only cared about his own self-preservation. Richard straightened his posture and turned away from Barbara. He directed his attention entirely toward Marcus Vance and me. His face was slick with heavy perspiration, but he forced his features into a mask of profound sorrow. He raised his hands in a gesture of complete surrender. He was preparing to sacrifice his golden child without a single second of hesitation. Marcus, please listen to me, Richard pleaded, his voice shaking with manufactured emotion. Monica, you must believe me. I had absolutely no idea about any of this. I am completely shocked by these horrific revelations. I am just a simple financial investor. I trusted my daughter to manage the medical side of the clinic. I trusted her when she handed me those patent documents. I am a victim of her deception just as much as anyone else in this room. She lied to her own father. Ashley gasped loudly. Her head snapped up and she stared at Richard with wide, horrified eyes. Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking with sheer panic. What are you doing? You knew everything. You told me to use the sketches. You told me to hide the malpractice settlements. Shut your mouth! Ashley, Richard roared, turning on her with vicious, aggressive fury. You are a complete disgrace. You lied to us. You told us you were a brilliant surgeon. You told us you invented that technology. You manipulated our trust and drained our family finances to cover up your gross incompetence. I will not allow you to drag me down with your criminal behavior. I will fully cooperate with the federal authorities and the state medical board. I will hand over every single document they need to prosecute you. Barbara watched her husband destroy their daughter with wide, unblinking eyes. She did not say a word to defend Ashley. She remained perfectly silent, calculating that Richard throwing Ashley to the wolves might actually save them both from federal indictment. Richard turned back to me. His aggressive tone instantly morphed into a pathetic, desperate whine. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table and leaned forward, bowing his head submissively. Monica, please, you have to listen to reason, he begged, stripping away every ounce of his remaining dignity. I understand you will not buy the surgical patent. I understand the medical practice is completely finished. But the Wilson Wellness Center is still a massive piece of prime commercial real estate. The physical building is located in the most expensive medical district in the city. You need expansion space for your hospital network. Buy the building, Monica. Just buy the property. I stared at the man who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a worthless failure. He was practically on his knees begging for my money. I will sell you the entire property for pennies on the dollar. Richard continued, his words spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. I will sign the deed over today. Just give me enough capital to cover the commercial loans and save my retirement accounts. You cannot leave your own father destitute, Monica. You have made your point. You won at this game. Now please show some basic family compassion and buy the physical building so Barbara and I do not lose our home." I looked at him with an expression of pure freezing ice. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering childhood trauma. I simply saw a pathetic criminal begging for a massive bailout. "Your building is completely worthless, Richard," I stated, my voice cutting through his desperate whining with absolute clinical precision. "You leveraged that property 3 separate times to pay off Ashley's malpractice settlements. The bank holds a primary mortgage and the IRS is preparing to place a massive federal tax lien on the deed by the end of the week. If my hospital network acquired that building, we would legally absorb your toxic debt. I will not give you a single dime. You are going to lose the clinic. You are going to lose the country club membership. You are going to lose your mansion. You are going to lose everything." In the far corner of the expansive boardroom, a shadow moved. Bradley had been sitting in a plush leather armchair, entirely silent since the meeting began. He was a prominent, highly successful plastic surgeon. He had accompanied my family to the hospital expecting to celebrate a $20 million victory. He had expected to marry into an elite, powerful medical dynasty. For the past 20 minutes, he had watched in absolute horror as his future in-laws were exposed as bankrupt, desperate criminals. Bradley possessed a pristine professional reputation. He catered to the wealthiest socialites in the city. He understood instantly that being associated with Ashley and her catastrophic surgical record would completely destroy his own lucrative career. The malpractice lawsuits, the federal fraud investigations, the intellectual property theft would utterly ruin his practice by mere association. He had made a cold, logical decision. Bradley stood up slowly. The quiet sound of his leather shoes stepping onto the hardwood floor drew the attention of everyone in the room. He did not look angry. He simply looked completely detached. He walked deliberately toward the center of the heavy mahogany table where Ashley sat. Earlier in the meeting, Ashley had removed her massive 5-carat diamond engagement ring. She had placed it prominently on the polished wood table as an arrogant display of her impending high society marriage. The huge diamond sparkled under the bright, recessed lighting of the boardroom. Bradley stopped next to Ashley. She looked up at him with desperate, pleading tears streaming down her face. "Bradley, please," Ashley whimpered, reaching a trembling hand out toward his tailored suit jacket. "Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them you support me. We can fix this together. We can move away and start a new clinic." Bradley did not look at her. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He reached down and slid the heavy diamond engagement ring off the polished mahogany table. He dropped the expensive piece of jewelry into his suit pocket with a quiet, dismissive click. He turned his back on my sister and walked directly toward the heavy oak doors. "Bradley, wait!" Ashley screamed, her voice tearing through the room with raw, agonizing panic. "You cannot leave me right now. We are getting married. You promised me." Bradley did not pause his stride. He pushed the heavy doors open and walked out into the executive corridor. The thick doors swung shut behind him, sealing his permanent exit. He was gone forever. Ashley sat completely frozen. The absolute magnitude of her destruction crashed down upon her in a devastating tidal wave. In less than half an hour, she had lost her $20 million payout. She had lost her medical license. Her own father had offered to testify against her to federal prosecutors. Her mother had remained entirely silent while she was thrown to the wolves. And the man she was supposed to marry had silently reclaimed his ring and walked out of her life without looking back. A terrifying, unnatural silence descended over the executive boardroom. The hospital board members watched my sister with a mixture of profound disgust and wary caution. Ashley stared blankly at the empty space on the table where her engagement ring had rested. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her chest heaved violently as her mind fractured under the crushing weight of total, absolute ruin. Something inside her completely snapped. The polished, arrogant facade of the golden child shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Ashley slowly raised her head and locked her manic, wild eyes directly onto me. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She bared her teeth like a cornered, feral animal. The veins in her forehead throbbed visibly against her pale skin. "You did this," Ashley hissed, her voice dropping to a demonic, terrifying whisper. You planned all of this from the very beginning. You knew about the audit. You knew about the patient files. You orchestrated this entire meeting just to humiliate me in front of these people. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on top of my leather binder. I orchestrated nothing, Ashley, I replied calmly. You forged documents. You butchered patients. I simply read the files you handed to me. You set me up! Ashley shrieked, launching herself up from the heavy leather chair. Her voice escalated into a deafening, hysterical scream. You stole my life! You stole my fiancé! You are a jealous, pathetic loser, and I am going to kill you! Ashley lunged completely across the massive mahogany table. She ignored the shocked shouts of the corporate attorneys. She kicked a stack of legal documents out of her way, scattering bright white papers into the air like violent confetti. Her eyes were completely unhinged. She reached out and grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher resting in the center of the table. Marcus Vance yelled a sharp, loud warning. Richard and Barbara screamed in absolute terror, but neither of them moved a single muscle to stop her. Ashley hurled herself toward the head of the table, swinging the heavy, solid crystal pitcher directly at my head with lethal, murderous intent. I did not panic. I did not scream. I pushed my chair backward, sliding smoothly away from the edge of the table. The heavy crystal pitcher missed my face by mere inches. Ashley lost her balance entirely. The violent momentum of her swing pulled her forward, and she crashed heavily onto the polished wood surface of the table. The heavy crystal pitcher slipped from her manicured fingers and slammed violently into the hardwood floor, shattering into hundreds of sharp, dangerous fragments. Water splashed aggressively across the room, soaking the pristine leather chairs and the expensive suits of the retreating board members. Ashley scrambled wildly on top of the table, clawing at the wood, trying desperately to reach me. I am going to destroy you, Monica, she screamed, spitting furiously as she thrashed against the scattered legal files. I am the golden child. You are nothing. The boardroom doors burst open with explosive force. 4 large, heavily armed hospital security guards rushed into the room. They moved with swift, tactical precision. 2 guards grabbed Ashley by the shoulders while the third secured her flailing legs. They dragged her roughly off the mahogany table and slammed her down onto the wet, crystal-covered floor. Ashley fought them with feral, hysterical strength. She kicked and scratched, screaming incoherent threats and vicious curses. The guards expertly pinned her arms behind her back, securing her wrists with heavy plastic restraint ties. Her pristine white medical coat was completely soaked in spilled water and stained with dirt from the floor. She looked absolutely deranged. Richard and Barbara stood pressed tightly against the glass wall, watching the violent, chaotic scene in pure, paralyzed horror. Their perfect, brilliant daughter was currently restrained on the floor, screaming like a lunatic, surrounded by shattered glass and ruined legal documents. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal suit. I looked down at Ashley as she thrashed against the firm grip of the security guards. Her face was pressed hard against the floor, her makeup completely ruined by her tears and the spilled water. The total destruction of the Wilson family was finally complete. The poison they had injected into my life for 3 decades had finally consumed them entirely. I turned away from my sister and looked directly at Marcus Vance. Send the files to the federal authorities, Marcus. I said, my voice perfectly steady in the chaotic room. We are officially done here. The 4 heavy hospital security guards had barely secured their plastic restraints before Ashley violently wrenched her left arm free. Driven by a surge of pure feral adrenaline, she launched her body across the remaining distance between us for one final desperate attack. She did not aim for the scattered documents or the ruined mahogany table. She aimed her manicured claws directly at my throat. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect my face. I simply took one fluid, deliberate step to my right. Ashley flew past me entirely. Her forward momentum carried her straight past the head of the table and directly into the towering silver executive refreshment cart stationed against the back wall. The impact was deafening. She collided chest first with the heavy metal tier, sending a massive sterling silver tray of ice water launching into the air. The heavy pitcher and 24 crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor. Gallons of freezing water cascaded directly over her head and shoulders. She collapsed onto the slippery floor in a pathetic heap. The freezing water instantly plastered her incredibly expensive designer white silk suit tightly against her skin. The pristine luxury fabric turned completely translucent and clung to her trembling frame like a wet, discarded tissue. Her perfectly sculpted updo unraveled, dropping heavy, wet strands of hair across her face. The mascara and heavy eyeliner she had meticulously applied that morning ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streams. She looked absolutely grotesque. She looked exactly like the fraudulent, desperate imposter she truly was. The guards hoisted her to her feet. The homicidal rage in her eyes had been instantly replaced by the crushing, suffocating reality of her profound public humiliation. The hospital executives watched her with expressions of absolute, unadulterated disgust. I turned my back on my shivering sister and focused my attention entirely on my father. Richard was completely backed into the corner of the boardroom. He looked like a man who had just been convicted of a capital crime. His breathing was rapid and shallow. He was desperately searching the faces of the corporate attorneys for any possible legal loophole. "You hacked our clinic servers!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "That is inadmissible evidence, Monica. We will sue you for corporate espionage." I picked up my digital voice recorder. "I did not hack anything, Richard," I replied. "When you aggressively pushed for this buyout, you blindly signed a comprehensive financial discovery waiver. You legally invited my auditors to examine every digital asset, including your communication logs and internal voicemail backups." Richard swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously against his tight collar. "You see, Dad?" I continued, holding the small silver recorder up for the entire room to see. When people are hiding massive multi-million-dollar secrets, they tend to get very careless with their digital communications. They leave voice messages for their private accountants discussing their crimes. They complain about their fraudulent financial maneuvers on unsecured clinic phone lines. They literally record their own confessions because they believe their massive unearned wealth makes them completely untouchable. I pressed play. The crisp, clear audio recording filled the large space with perfect fidelity. It was a recorded phone call from exactly 10 years ago. The voices belonged to Richard and his former private wealth manager. The audio played loudly. I do not care about the legal risks, the recorded voice of my father barked, echoing through the boardroom. "Just execute the transfer immediately. I have Ashley's medical school tuition due by the end of the week, and she needs the capital for her new luxury condominium. Just sign Monica's name on the primary release forms. I have her signature perfectly copied. No one is ever going to audit a family trust fund disbursement. Just forge the documents and wire the money directly into Ashley's primary account." The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening heavy silence in its wake. I set the digital recorder back down on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly into my father's wide, terrified eyes. "You did not just buy her medical degree with the trust fund Granddad left for both of us." I stated, my words cutting through the freezing air like a sharpened blade. "You literally forged my signature on federal banking documents to steal my half of the inheritance. You committed severe felony wire fraud and grand larceny to fund your golden child's lavish, pathetic lifestyle. You bought her expensive cars and you bought her a fake career. But you could not buy her basic medical competence." Richard slid down the glass wall until his knees hit the wet marble floor. He had heard his own voice confessing to a massive federal crime in a room filled with elite corporate attorneys. The legal team was already taking notes, preparing to hand everything to the federal prosecutor. Marcus Vance stepped forward, his arms crossed firmly over his chest. "This is entirely unprecedented, Mr. Wilson," Marcus said, his voice vibrating with absolute contempt. "You brought a fraudulent surgeon into my hospital network and attempted to sell us stolen intellectual property using a business built entirely on stolen inheritance funds. We are contacting the authorities immediately." Richard crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning his pride. He ignored the shattered glass cutting into his expensive suit pants. "Monica, please." Richard begged, his voice a wretched, pathetic whine. Please do not do this. They will put me in federal prison. They will take the house. They will take everything. I will give you the clinic. I will give you the entire Wilson Wellness Center for free. Just take the business and let us walk away quietly. You can bury the audio recording. You can hide the patient outcome reports. We are your family. I looked down at the pathetic, groveling man who had tormented me for my entire existence. I felt absolutely nothing. I do not want your failing, fraudulent medical practice, Richard, I replied, my voice cold and hard. Your business is a toxic liability filled with $12 million of high-interest commercial debt and massive pending malpractice lawsuits. I am not absorbing your criminal mistakes. I held out a single sheet of paper. This is my final offer, I announced. I am going to execute a hostile real estate acquisition. I will buy the brick-and-mortar building and land for exactly 10 cents on the dollar. I am not assuming a single penny of your commercial debt. I am buying the empty shell to bulldoze it and build a legitimate research facility. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. 10 cents on the dollar would not even cover a fraction of his massive outstanding loans. It would leave him completely bankrupt and utterly destitute. And this real estate buyout does not buy your freedom. I continued driving the final nail into his coffin. I am forwarding the entire clinical dossier, including the blind patient outcome reports and the evidence of your intellectual property theft, directly to the state medical board today. I am also handing the forged trust fund audio recording to the federal authorities. Ashley let out a loud guttural wail from the grip of the security guards. You cannot do that, Ashley screamed, trashing violently against her plastic restraints. They will revoke my medical license. I will go to jail. I am a doctor. I am a brilliant surgeon. You are a butcher, Ashley, I stated calmly. You are a profound danger to the public, and you will never hold a scalpel again. Your license is gone. Your career is completely over. You are going to face massive federal fraud charges and severe medical malpractice indictments. The Wilson family legacy ends right here in this room today. Barbara had been standing completely frozen near the executive doorway. She had watched her husband's crimes exposed to the world. She had watched her precious golden child dripping with ice water and restrained like a common violent criminal. She had watched her entire empire of wealth status and unearned superiority completely evaporate into thin air. The reality of her impending poverty and total social destruction finally penetrated her thick, arrogant skull. She was going to lose her mansion, her expensive country club memberships, and her elite friends. She was going to be a penniless outcast married to a convicted felon with a disgraced, imprisoned daughter. Barbara finally broke. The haughty, untouchable matriarch completely shattered. She let out a long, agonizing scream that tore through her throat. She dropped her designer handbag, letting it spill its expensive contents across the wet marble floor. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed completely. She fell to her knees, weeping hysterically, her manicured hands clawing desperately at the cold, hard floor as her perfect world burned to ashes. The toxic empire they had ruthlessly built upon my suffering was now nothing more than absolute worthless dust. The pristine silence of the executive boardroom was broken only by the ragged, pathetic sound of Barbara drawing breath. She remained collapsed on the polished marble floor, surrounded by the glittering, shattered fragments of crystal and the spreading pool of freezing water. The haughty, untouchable matriarch who had strutted through the hospital lobby just an hour prior was entirely gone. In her place was a broken, desperate woman, facing the absolute destruction of her carefully curated social empire. She ignored the expensive, ruined fabric of her cream pantsuit as the icy water soaked through to her knees. She ignored the horrified, disgusted stares of the elite hospital executives and the sharp-eyed corporate attorneys who watched her total breakdown with clinical detachment. Her manicured hands, adorned with heavy diamond rings, bought with stolen trust fund money, clawed at the slick floor as she dragged herself forward. She moved with a frantic, humiliating urgency toward the head of the heavy mahogany table. She reached me, Her trembling wet fingers shot out and desperately grabbed the impeccably tailored fabric of my charcoal gray suit jacket. She gripped the expensive wool blend with a sudden feral strength, twisting the material in her hands, as if I were a physical life raft in the middle of a violent, raging ocean. The heavy string of expensive pearls around her neck clattered loudly against the floor as she tilted her head back to look up at me. Her perfectly applied makeup had dissolved into a chaotic, smeared mess of dark mascara and pale foundation. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, cutting clean lines through the expensive cosmetics. "Monica, please!" Barbara sobbed, her voice a shrill, agonizing wail that echoed harshly against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "You have to stop this right now. You cannot do this to us. We are your family." Her chest heaved with violent, desperate sobs. "You cannot leave us with nothing. I am your mother." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her statement hung heavily in the freezing air of the boardroom. She clung to my jacket, her knuckles turning stark white from the intense pressure of her grip, weeping with a profound, terrifying hysteria. She genuinely believed that invoking the biological title of mother would somehow magically erase decades of systemic abuse, calculated neglect, and massive financial fraud. She believed the word family was a protective shield that could deflect the devastating, inescapable consequences of her own criminal greed. She thought her tears would somehow manipulate me into surrendering my entire empire just to save her from the horrific reality she had built with her own two hands. I did not step back. I did not flinch away from her desperate, clutching hands. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping woman kneeling in the shattered crystal and freezing water at my feet. I looked at the woman who had happily watched her husband steal my inheritance, who had eagerly cheered as her golden child poured industrial bleach over my only professional interview suit, and who had gleefully thrown me out into the freezing night with absolutely nothing but a garbage bag full of ruined clothes. I felt a profound, total absence of anger. I felt no lingering childhood trauma, no desperate need for her maternal validation, and no lingering sadness. I felt only cold, absolute and total clarity. I reached down with slow, deliberate, and perfectly measured movements. I placed my hands over her trembling, wet fingers. I did not strike her, and I did not raise my voice. I gently, firmly, and inexorably pried her manicured fingers off the fabric of my tailored jacket. I bent her hands back, forcing her to release her desperate grip, and let her arms drop uselessly to her sides. I looked directly into her terrified, wide, mascara-stained eyes. The temperature in the executive boardroom seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. "You weren't my mother when you stood in the hallway and smiled while you let Ashley ruin my only chance at a surgical interview." I stated, my voice echoing with a calm, surgical precision that sliced through her hysterical sobbing. "You were not acting as a mother when you watched her destroy my property, and you certainly were not a mother when you threw me out of the house to protect her fragile, unearned ego." I took a single deliberate step back, severing our physical connection entirely. Barbara remained kneeling, her empty hands resting in the pool of water, staring up at me with profound, paralyzing dread. "You were never a mother to me, Barbara." I continued, addressing her by her first name, officially stripping away the unearned maternal title. "You were just her eager, willing enabler. You actively facilitated her delusions, you funded her incompetence, and you gleefully participated in the theft of my future to guarantee her comfort." I smoothed the slightly wrinkled fabric of my jacket, restoring my flawless professional armor. "You made your massive financial investment 10 years ago when you chose to back a fraudulent, incompetent golden child using stolen money. Today is not a tragedy. Today is not a cruel, vindictive punishment. Today is just the market correcting itself." Barbara's mouth opened and closed in silent, suffocating horror. The brutal, clinical logic of my statement completely paralyzed her. She had no defense, no argument, and no manipulative counterattack left to deploy. The harsh, blinding light of accountability had finally illuminated the dark, toxic rot of the Wilson family legacy, and she could not escape the glare. She was completely finished. I turned my back on the kneeling, weeping woman and shifted my attention back to the head of the heavy mahogany table. Marcus Vance, the chief executive officer of the hospital network, stood waiting in respectful silence. He slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the polished wood surface. The portfolio contained the final, heavily revised commercial real estate acquisition documents. The terms were brutally clear and utterly non-negotiable. I was purchasing the physical brick-and-mortar building of the Wilson Wellness Center for precisely 10 cents on the dollar, completely stripping the property from their control without assuming a single penny of their massive $12 million commercial debt or their toxic looming malpractice liabilities. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit jacket and withdrew a heavy, polished silver fountain pen. I clicked the cap open. The sharp metallic sound rang out clearly in the silent, tense room. I leaned over the table and signed my legal name on the solid black line at the bottom of the final contract page. The dark ink flowed smoothly onto the thick, expensive parchment, permanently transferring the prime real estate into my corporate portfolio and officially rendering Richard and Barbara entirely homeless and utterly bankrupt. I placed the silver pen down on the wood and closed the leather portfolio with a definitive echoing thud. I looked across the room toward the 4 heavily armed hospital security guards who were still firmly restraining Ashley on the floor. I gave them a single sharp, authoritative nod. The guards moved with immediate synchronized military precision. 2 of them hauled Ashley to her feet, ignoring her renewed frantic screaming as they dragged her toward the heavy oak double doors. The other 2 guards stepped quickly behind Richard and Barbara, seizing them firmly by the arms and hauling them upward. Richard struggled wildly, his face contorting with a sudden, vicious surge of aggressive, desperate fury. He kicked out at the guards, trying frantically to twist his body away from their unyielding, powerful grip. "You cannot do this to me!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking with panicked rage as the guards forced him toward the exit. "I am a prominent investor. I will tie you up in endless commercial litigation. I will hire the most vicious, aggressive corporate defense attorneys in this entire city, and I will sue you for every single penny you have. Monica, I will destroy you in civil court." As Richard thrashed violently against the firm grip of the security guards, a tall, imposing figure stepped smoothly out from the quiet shadows near the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. It was my lead corporate counsel, a sharp, unyielding legal shark who had spent the last 3 months meticulously dismantling the Wilson family's fraudulent financial empire. He wore an immaculate, perfectly tailored dark suit and carried a stark white heavy legal envelope in his right hand. He walked calmly, deliberately across the room and stepped directly into Richard's chaotic, struggling path. The lawyer did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He simply reached forward and pressed the heavy white envelope firmly against Richard's sweating, heaving chest, forcing my father to instinctively grab the document before it fell to the floor. "You are not going to be suing anyone, Mr. Wilson," my lawyer stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. "That is an official expedited subpoena from the United States Department of Justice. You are being formally indicted for massive federal tax evasion, systemic wire fraud, and the grand larceny of a protected trust fund. Federal agents are currently waiting for you beside your vehicle in the parking garage." The heavy white envelope trembled violently in his hands. As my lawyer stepped back, Richard stumbled backward, completely paralyzed by the sudden, devastating reality of federal indictment. He realized the agents were waiting downstairs, blocking his only escape route. The distinct, sharp realization of his total, inescapable ruin echoed through the polished executive boardroom, finalizing the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. Barbara wailed helplessly against the cold marble floor, her shrill cries entirely ignored by the hospital executives, who were rapidly filing out of the room to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage. I did not stay to watch my father surrender to the waiting authorities. I picked up my leather binder, straightened my tailored suit jacket, and walked out the glass doors without looking back. The poisonous chapter of my life involving the Wilson family was permanently sealed. 6 months passed with the rapid, relentless momentum of profound structural change. The heavy, suffocating heat of that disastrous summer confrontation gave way to the crisp, biting winds of a new winter. I had kept every single promise I made in that boardroom. I had purchased the physical brick and mortar building of the Wilson Wellness Center for precisely 10 cents on the dollar. The day the title officially transferred to my corporate holdings, I ordered a complete and total demolition of the interior. I wanted every trace of Ashley and her horrific medical malpractice eradicated from the premises. The old gaudy chandeliers, the cheap faux marble flooring, and the ostentatious reception desk, designed to intimidate vulnerable patients, were ripped out and thrown directly into industrial dumpsters. In their place, I built something entirely different. I poured millions of dollars into the massive renovation. Every single cent of the construction costs was funded directly by the exploding royalty payouts from my authentic surgical patents. The technology Richard had desperately tried to steal had revolutionized cardiothoracic procedures worldwide, generating a massive continuous stream of clean, legitimate revenue. I took that wealth and created the Boston Horizon Community Health Center. The new facility was a state-of-the-art medical sanctuary specifically designed for underprivileged families who had been systematically ignored by the elite healthcare networks. The expansive waiting room now featured bright, natural light, warm wooden accents, and comfortable seating. We installed the most advanced diagnostic imaging machines available, replacing her outdated, dangerous surgical suites with pristine, modernized pediatric and general practice exam rooms. We did not accept private high-tier insurance. We operated entirely on a subsidized community grant model and my personal patent royalties. It was the ultimate poetic justice. The exact physical location where my family had maliciously plotted to steal my future and butcher innocent people for profit was now saving lives for absolutely free. While my new clinic flourished, the natural consequences of their staggering greed consumed them with absolute brutal efficiency. The state medical board did not simply revoke the medical license. They permanently banned her from practicing any form of healthcare in the entire country. The federal fraud investigation triggered by the audit files I provided exposed the sheer terrifying scale of her malpractice. She avoided federal prison only by agreeing to heavily testify against the corrupt clinic administrators who had facilitated her surgical cover-ups. But avoiding prison did not save her from total financial annihilation. The massive civil lawsuits filed by her former mutilated patients completely drained her hidden offshore accounts. She was forced to liquidate her luxury condominium, her expensive cars, and her extensive collection of designer jewelry just to afford her mounting legal defense fees. Her pristine high society reputation was reduced to toxic radioactive ash. Bradley, the prominent plastic surgeon who had abandoned her in the boardroom, publicly denounced her and married a wealthy heiress 3 months later. Ashley was currently working a grueling minimum-wage retail job at a discount clothing outlet in a rundown strip mall. She spent her days folding cheap synthetic shirts and dealing with angry bargain hunters. Her perfectly manicured hands were now calloused and dry. Her arrogant, unearned superiority had been replaced by the crushing, suffocating reality of poverty. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of stolen achievements, and when that foundation collapsed, she was left with absolutely nothing. Richard and Barbara faced an even more spectacular and devastating destruction. The federal tax evasion and wire fraud indictments triggered an immediate catastrophic freeze on all their remaining assets. The Internal Revenue Service seized their primary bank accounts, placing a massive, unmovable lien on their sprawling suburban mansion. The bank initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings within weeks of the highly publicized arrest. They were given exactly 5 days to vacate the massive property they had illegally leveraged to fund those delusions. Barbara had desperately attempted to reach out to her elite country club friends, begging for emergency loans and temporary housing. Every single one of them blocked her number. The high society circle she had ruthlessly dominated for decades instantly severed all ties treating her like a highly contagious disease. Without the stolen wealth, Barbara was completely stripped of her power and influence. She was forced to pawn her remaining pearls and designer handbags just to afford the security deposit on a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment located on the grimy industrial outskirts of the city. Richard was currently out on a heavily monitored federal bail, wearing an ankle monitor while awaiting his criminal trial. He spent his days sitting in the cramped, poorly insulated apartment staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. He could not secure employment. His prestigious banking license was permanently revoked, and his name was synonymous with massive corporate fraud. The man who had spent my entire childhood demanding absolute perfection and ruthless financial success was now surviving on cheap canned soup and counting pennies to pay the heating bill. They had utterly destroyed themselves. I did not have to lift a single finger to punish them. I simply exposed the truth and let the natural, unyielding laws of consequence execute the final verdict. It was a Tuesday morning. The air outside was freezing, but the interior of the Boston Horizon Community Health Center was warm and bustling with energetic, purposeful activity. I walked slowly down the pristine, brightly lit central corridor, holding a hot cup of black coffee and a digital tablet loaded with the morning patient schedules. The gentle hum of the clinic was deeply comforting. Dedicated nurses moved swiftly between exam rooms, speaking softly to nervous children and exhausted parents. The sterile, sharp smell of the old clinic had been entirely replaced by the clean, comforting scent of lavender and fresh linen. I felt a profound, deep sense of absolute peace. The decades of suffocating pressure, the relentless toxic comparisons, and the brutal emotional abuse were finally completely gone. I had reclaimed my life, my career, and my dignity. I turned the corner and walked toward the expansive main reception area to check in with the lead triage coordinator. The waiting room was particularly crowded today, filled with local families seeking routine vaccinations and free pediatric consultations. As I approached the curved mahogany reception desk, I glanced at the line of new patients filling out digital intake forms. The automated glass doors slid open, admitting a blast of freezing winter air and another patient seeking assistance. I looked up from my digital tablet, ready to offer a polite, welcoming smile. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I stopped walking entirely, my sensible leather heels freezing against the polished floor. Standing at the front of the intake line, gripping the edge of the reception desk with trembling, weathered hands, was a familiar, aged face. The expensive tailored suits and the haughty, arrogant posture were completely gone. The figure wore a faded, oversized winter coat and a cheap knitted scarf. The eyes that looked up and locked onto mine were filled with a desperate, exhausted humiliation. It was Richard. My father stood in the lobby of the free clinic I had built from the ashes of his ruined empire. He looked small and frail, shivering in the warm air of the reception area. The ankle monitor bulged visibly beneath the hem of his worn trousers. He did not speak immediately. He just stared at me across the pristine lobby. The silence between us stretched out, pulling the heavy weight of our destroyed history into the present moment. Barbara stepped up directly beside him, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shivering shoulders. She looked utterly defeated, her graying hair unkempt and her face lined with deep, permanent exhaustion. She clutched a crumpled paper health voucher in her right hand, her eyes cast downward in complete, total shame. They had absolutely nowhere else to go. The private hospitals had rejected their completely non-existent insurance, and the federal freeze had drained their accounts. They were forced to seek free medical care at the exact facility they had previously owned. It was the absolute, final, devastating, perfect, natural, poetic consequence. Barbara's hands were shaking violently as she gripped the cold edge of the polished mahogany reception desk. I stood absolutely still, studying the woman who had once confidently commanded high society ballrooms with terrifying iron-fisted authority. The physical transformation was completely staggering. She was wearing a faded, deeply unfashionable navy blue wool coat that looked like it had been purchased from a discount clearance rack at least a decade ago. The heavy, luxurious silk scarves and the blinding diamond tennis bracelets she used to arrogantly flaunt were entirely gone, replaced by frayed pulling threads and bare age-spotted wrists. Her perfectly maintained blonde hair had grown out into a harsh, stark gray, pulled back into a messy, uneven knot at the nape of her neck. The deep, heavy lines of permanent exhaustion and profound stress had etched themselves permanently into her pale face, making her look incredibly fragile and ancient. She was no longer the imposing, terrifying matriarch of the Wilson family empire. She was just another broken, destitute citizen waiting in line for subsidized public charity. Richard stood completely mute beside her. His shoulders were slumped forward in total surrender. The man who had ruthlessly orchestrated the aggressive theft of my future was staring down at the scuffed toes of his cheap synthetic leather shoes. He did not possess the courage to lift his heavy head and meet my gaze. The heavy, restrictive federal ankle monitor bulged awkwardly against his thin socks, a permanent, glaring reminder of his massive criminal fraud. They had arrived at the exact physical location of their former illegal medical empire, clutching a crumpled state-issued health voucher, praying for basic medical charity. Barbara slowly raised her chin. Her bloodshot, exhausted eyes locked onto my face. I anticipated the familiar surge of toxic rage. I expected her to launch into a bitter theatrical tirade to scream loudly about how I had stolen her property to demand immediate preferential treatment simply because she was my mother. I braced myself for the inevitable chaotic scene. But the screaming never came. There was no haughty arrogance left in her posture. There was no vicious, entitled venom lingering in her voice. The devastating, brutal machinery of natural consequences had systematically crushed every single ounce of her massive ego. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated desperation. She was entirely broken. "Monica," Barbara whispered, her voice a dry, raspy scrape that barely carried over the bustling, energetic noise of the busy community clinic. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the two triage nurses standing behind the reception desk. We did not know where else to go. The private network clinics violently rejected Richard's application for financial assistance. The federal courts froze absolutely everything. We have nothing left. I looked at her with an expression of absolute freezing calm. I did not feel a single tremor of sympathy, nor did I feel the dark, intoxicating thrill of vindictive revenge. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of quiet closure. I was looking at two strangers who had completely destroyed themselves through their own monumental, unforgivable greed. "You are standing in a free public health facility, Barbara." I stated, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any emotional warmth. I deliberately used her first name, officially maintaining the permanent, unyielding boundary I had drawn 6 months ago. "The intake nurses will process your state voucher. You will wait in the lobby until your designated number is officially called. You will receive the exact same standard of excellent comprehensive medical care as every other citizen in this building. There is no preferential treatment." Richard flinched visibly at my cold professional tone sinking deeper into his oversized faded coat. But Barbara did not step back. She did not retreat to the waiting room seating area. Instead, she leaned closer to the mahogany counter, her shaking hands pressing flat against the polished wood surface. "We need the medical voucher processed, yes." Barbara stammered, her lower lip trembling uncontrollably as she forced the words out of her throat. "But that is not the only reason I needed to speak with you today. I saw the signs outside. I saw the massive structural expansion. I know you are hiring new staff to manage the exponentially increased patient volume." I raised a single questioning eyebrow, maintaining my absolute icy professionalism. I waited in total silence, forcing her to fully articulate her desperate request without offering her a single inch of emotional assistance. Barbara took a shaky, shallow breath. "I need a job, Monica." She pleaded, the absolute humiliation of the request bringing fresh, hot tears to her exhausted eyes. "We cannot afford the rent on the new apartment. The federal fines are rapidly taking everything Richard earns from his supervised community service. Ashley is drowning in her own legal debts, and she utterly refuses to speak to us. We are entirely destitute. I desperately need an income." She quickly swiped a hand across her wet cheek, trying desperately to salvage a tiny, pathetic fragment of her former pride. I know exactly how a medical facility operates. I spent 30 years carefully managing the social calendar and the administrative hierarchy of our old clinic. I can reliably answer the phones. I can file the complex medical records. I can effectively manage the reception desk. I am highly organized. Just give me a low-level administrative position, please. I am willing to work for minimum wage. You cannot leave us to starve. I stared down at the woman who had gleefully poured industrial bleach onto my only professional suit, just to ensure her fraudulent golden child would succeed. I looked at the woman who had stood completely silent in a glass boardroom, while my father actively plotted to illegally steal my patented surgical technology. She was begging me for a clerical job inside the very building she had illegally leveraged to deliberately hide her daughter's horrific medical malpractice. I did not scream at her. I did not lean over the desk and gloat about my massive, undeniable victory. I did not loudly list her countless devastating crimes or remind her of the decades of psychological torture she had maliciously inflicted upon my life. Screaming would imply that she still possessed the power to negatively affect my emotional state. Gloating would imply that her current miserable existence somehow validated my success. I did not need her validation. I had fully reclaimed my legacy, my sanity, and my absolute freedom. I maintained my flawless, impenetrable corporate armor. I looked at her not as a traumatized daughter facing her former abuser, but as a highly successful chief executive officer, evaluating a completely unqualified applicant. Administrative positions at Boston Horizon Community Health Center require a spotless federal background check. I stated, my voice echoing with crisp clinical detachment. Our front desk coordinators handle highly sensitive patient data, heavily regulated federal grant distributions, and secure pharmaceutical logs. Given your deep, extensive, and highly publicized legal involvement with Richard's federal wire fraud and tax evasion indictments, you do not qualify for any clerical or administrative position within this hospital network. You would be a catastrophic legal liability. Barbara's face crumpled in total despair. She sagged heavily against the mahogany counter, the last tiny ember of her manufactured hope completely extinguished. She knew my assessment was entirely factual. Her name was permanently branded with toxic radioactive scandal. No legitimate corporate entity would ever trust her near a computer terminal or a financial ledger ever again. Please, she whimpered, her voice breaking into a pathetic, ragged sob. There has to be something. Anything. I stood perfectly still for a long, heavy moment, evaluating the broken woman weeping quietly in my pristine lobby. I looked past her, glancing down the immaculate, gleaming hallway of my community clinic. The floors were flawlessly polished, reflecting the bright, warm overhead lighting. The entire facility represented clean, honest, relentless hard work. I reached down behind the reception desk. I deliberately bypassed the stack of thick, detailed administrative employment contracts and pulled out a single thin sheet of standard blue paper. I placed it flat on the mahogany counter and slid it smoothly across the polished wood directly toward Barbara's trembling hands. Barbara stared down at the blue paper through her tear-filled eyes. It was a standard entry-level employment application. She looked at the bold black letters printed clearly at the top of the page. It was an application for the overnight janitorial staff. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and absolute crushing ego death. The woman who had spent her entire adult life dripping in diamonds, drinking expensive champagne, and commanding elite society galas was staring at an application to aggressively scrub toilets and empty biohazard bins. I met her horrified gaze with eyes like frozen steel. I did not offer a single trace of an apology. We pay $15 an hour, I stated, delivering the final absolute truth with unyielding glacial precision. If you can mop a floor without complaining, you can interview next Tuesday. Do not be late. I did not wait to see if she picked up the blue paper. I did not wait to hear Richard's pathetic, muffled response. I simply turned away from the reception desk, severing my visual connection to their stagnant, suffocating decay. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit jacket, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders relaxed, and my mind entirely clear. I walked away from them, stepping purposefully into the bright, bustling halls of the hospital I had built with my own two hands. The air smelled of clean linen and fresh antiseptic. The energetic, purposeful sounds of dedicated nurses healing patients and genuine, honest work surrounded me in a warm, protective embrace. I had successfully reclaimed my life and my legacy. I had not won through malicious cruelty or toxic vengeance. I had won by building an undeniable, towering empire of truth and by allowing the toxic, entitled elements of my former family to completely suffocate under the crushing, inescapable weight of their own monumental failures. I stepped forward into my brilliant, limitless future, leaving the ghosts of the Wilson family permanently behind me, in the dust, fully embracing a life defined by total peace, absolute power, and unapologetic success.